I'm Kate Fossen, founder at Brand Pollinators, and we support purpose-driven emerging brands to help them scale by connecting them with resources and connecting them to each other to learn and grow in the best way possible. So a lot of the brands in our community are really focused on the impact they're making. And that's why we wanted to bring our guest today, Amanda. She is the co-founder at awarex.io. And so in the past 15 years, Amanda has worked with various sustainability roles, including the Chicago Mayor's Office, global environmental design firm, and most recently as the Dean of the Urban Agriculture Department at the City Colleges of Chicago. So from her experience in promoting programs, growing partnerships, aligning funding, she saw this opportunity to connect financial resources with the people who are trying to make the world a better place. So she started this company, AwareX, which is like a sustainable finance software that translates ESG criteria into metrics that financial institutions can use for their impact lending. So Amanda, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kate. That was very nice. It's so good to be here. I met Kate a couple months ago because she's really good friends with my next door neighbor. So the world is such a small place, and I'm really happy to be here. And I love all things ESG. I really do believe that it's the baseline of what a purpose-driven company can really thrive on, because I know you all have different impact in different ways, but starting with ESG and then going from there, I think can really propel your business overall. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. So Amanda was asking me about some of the different types of companies that are in our community. So if you want to just drop in the chat sort of what type of product you have or what your industry is, then that might be helpful for her to gear some of the answers so that they're most helpful for you. And as usual, we welcome your questions throughout. Feel free to raise your hand or chime in, drop something in the chat if you have a question. We want to make sure that this is really valuable for you. And so, yeah, please let us know if there's something we're not addressing. So I just wanted to get started because Amanda has a lot of experience with ESG and we hear it a lot, but can you just tell us, breaking it down, like what is ESG and what it means, like how it relates to a consumer brand?
Sure. Well, so ESG at the very basic level is environmental, social, and governance factors that would impact a business's operations. So you're looking at how a business runs through the lens of, basically sustainability. And so the environmental can be climate, it can be waste, it can be pollution, social can be labor, your internal labor practices and how you treat your employees. It can be the diversity of what your employee makeup looks like and where those employees are situated in your organization. And then finally, governance can be anything from your board composition to procedures and policies you have in place. Everybody I'm sure has heard of SVB, and the breakdown in that was attributed to failed governance policies, right? Like they didn't have strong governance factors in place, and that is why they failed. So, and the way that AwareX works is that it looks at industry specific. So not all industries are created equal, right? Like, so for example, the coffee industry is not going to have the same ESG criteria that perhaps an agriculture, well, that is agriculture. So like an apparel, right? Doug, I'm pretty sure you're like an apparel company. And so your ESG criteria would not be the same. And I think that that's where ESG really gets a bad rap, is that it's cloudy. And as of right now, a lot of ESG is done by ratings, which are aggregated data that, different rating agencies kind of pull and use public information and kind of put it all together, but it doesn't really tell you the full story, right? Like, so one example that I like to talk about is, Pepsi. They said that they are, this great ESG company, but they didn't look at the water pollution that they have for their main product, right? Like, so they're talking about perhaps something else they're doing that's wonderful, but their main product, one of their, raw materials that is a big percentage of their product, was not addressed. And so you see that a lot with companies, and that's where you get the greenwashing and the lack of trust in ESG claims.
So you're saying it's like really holistic. It's not just like a little E, a little S, a little G. It's like it has to be all of everything.
It has to be specific, right? Like it has to be material to your industry to really matter. And so that is why, we focus on, only what really matters. Like everything else you're doing is great, but if it's not applicable to your industry or material to what your operations are, then it's just a nice thing to do.
Yeah, and that was a good reminder about the Silicon Valley Bank too, because it's like that's where, if you're not paying attention to these ESG elements, that it can really turn into something that completely implodes or creates a really negative impact, if you're not paying attention on the beginning end. So
Right.
I think a lot of the brands here today, and a lot of the brands in our community are kind of on the smaller side. So, they're not Pepsi, but what's a way that smaller brands can kind of incorporate this with where they are at their stage?
Well, that's like the best thing about ESG is that you really can start it at any phase. Like me as a startup, I can still implement the policies that I need as a software to make sure I protect my bottom line, because in my industry, governance is going to be a very high financial indicator as far as ESG goes. But, for example, one of the agriculture ones, starting now and identifying your suppliers, making sure that, you have your ingredient list and your raw materials sourced, and where your labor is coming from. Like these are all things that you can do at the beginning so that you don't get to a point where you're so big that it's difficult to change. And so that's kind of the hope of the software, is that it makes you aware of what you're doing and what to focus on at any stage you're at.
So how does that come into play if brands are using like a third party, like a co-packer or a co-manufacturer, or they're sourcing their through like a third party? What does that look like in terms of tracking that information?
So that is going to be pretty relevant here in the next couple of years as far as regulations go. And so they're, emissions scope 1, 2, and 3, right? And like having to identify your impact through either your direct operations, your supplier chain operations, or even their supplier chain operations. So there's blockchain technology now that you can, get to identify like where your ingredient starts, regardless of, your ecosystem. But I think it's really important to know where your ingredients are coming from and to be on the same page with your supplier and their suppliers, because in a couple of years, this will be like required information as far as like the emissions scope 3 lens. Has everybody heard of that? Like scope 1, 2, and 3 regulations?
I'm not very familiar with it, so.
Okay, so basically it's the SEC, so the Securities Exchange Commission, and they're trying to help investors identify companies and where they stand in ESG. And so a lot of with the climate and the kind of air quality and emissions, the government is becoming much more focused on the financial lens of ESG. And so that's why the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is the license that I license with, is only focused on the financial materiality, because that at the end of the day, the investors want to know what you're doing in terms of managing these risks. And so there are regulations around your emissions, and they are breaking them down by scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So scope 1 is your, basic emissions and your input. And scope 2 is like suppliers and so on and so forth. So it kind of gets more nitty gritty the farther it goes. And they're just on scope 1 right now. But I mean, in the next couple of years, it'll be required reporting.
Yeah, that's so good to be thinking forward, because when you have a small company, it's a lot easier to kind of corral that information and sort of move forward in the right direction, rather than working backwards when you're a really big company to try to untangle the web that you've created if you don't have that information gathered.
Yeah.
Hopefully all will be bigger companies, much bigger companies, much sooner. So it'll be important for you to have those things in place earlier on. When you're talking about blockchain and kind of that aspect of tracking the supply chain, it made me think about the traceability aspect too, because I think that's something that consumers are more and more interested in as well, is like, where is this food coming from? Like, where are you? I know my dad used to, like, he eats pumpkin seeds all the time, and he found out that the pumpkin seeds he was getting were from China, and he's like, well, I don't really want these. I want them from somewhere else. So it's like digging into where the products come from, and being able to share that with consumers is actually beneficial for the consumer to know too.
Definitely. I mean, this is really being driven by consumers. Like, consumers are driving ESG awareness and transparency 100%, from the institutional investor lens to the consumer buying the product lens to, demanding regulations be changed. And so if you're a brand, you can really capitalize on that if you're out there saying, this is what we're doing, this is our stuff, and being transparent about it.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about how this plays with something like a B Corp certification, because I feel like B Corp is one that kind of covers a lot of different aspects, including social and environmental. So is that something where, I guess you're talking about ESG is a lot more like financially focused on I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, the difference between them?
I do. And if anyone is B Corp certified, good on you, because I know how difficult that is and what a lift that is. And so, congratulations. That is not anything I would want to minimize. But in ESG is not just financial. It's just the way that we're looking at it is we're looking at it from the financial lens, because that's what we truly, think matter, at the end of the day. I think everybody can admit that regardless of your purpose, like, you need to make money, or you need to, be sustainable, at least in terms of your finances as well. So the B Corp is great, but it is not going to give you a baseline in like what would impact your bottom line, and just that, right? Like, we're not going to talk about all the other things that you could possibly do in your ESG program. It's only going to be what actually matters. Like, I just did the apparel kind of survey, and there were no questions in the environment. So like anything you would do that would, benefit the environment wouldn't impact your bottom line. And so while the B Corp may have you doing something like that, in our software, we wouldn't provide like recommendations or goals for that, because we would say that wouldn't affect your bottom line.
Okay, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So then how does ESG impact the value of the company and its likelihood of success? Because it sounds like that would be more tied towards like a specific path to success.
Well, I think it's really about business efficiency and making your operations as tight as you can. And so you're identifying like processes and procedures that would significantly disrupt your operations, right? Like, so for example, in the apparel industry, one of the criteria were, do you know what your raw materials are? Do you know the environmental risk to those raw materials? And do you have a process in place to reduce that need for the raw materials. And so, because if you work it backwards, if you have some sort of supply chain disruption and you can't get access to your raw materials, what is that going to do to your operations? What if you have to pay twice as much because of some drought and now you have to go a different direction? And so that's kind of where we look at it from like the business lens and like the operations as far as being viable, and like risk reduction is really important, right? Like you're reducing your risk, but you're also creating a more sustainable product. And so for investors, insurance companies, lenders, anybody that's going to be giving you money, they want to be able to see that you're aware of what's happening and you have measures in place to mitigate those risks, as well as, do you have R&D money to find substitute materials, what percentage of your materials are recyclable, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And if you're approaching investors or looking for funding, then I mean, they're obviously going to want to see that you have some level of operational efficiency and you have that path to profitability. So if a brand is operating with like this really high integrity, then I think what we're sort of missing is that like the measurement aspect of it, because I feel like a lot of the brands that I've talked to, they're doing a lot of things behind the scenes, but they're not necessarily measuring what they're doing. So in terms, like, I know your software is more specific to the industry, but I mean, in terms of like ESG in general, like, are there standards for specific things that get measured, or like, how do they know what to measure or how much?
Well, what to measure, you would look at what would impact, right? Like, so you would look at those criteria. And then what our philosophy is to find your baseline and then go from there. So if you're doing something and you want to improve that, then you just set your own target. If you're already hitting the industry standards, or you're above and beyond, like, is that good enough for you? Is that something that you should, make a target? Can you do something in something else, to better round out your operations? And so we, as opposed to looking at it from like a rating system, I really don't like the rating system, to be honest. I think it's confusing and is not clear, or give you like a way to improve your own internal benchmarks. And so I think it's better to look at it from a lens of what are you doing now and how can you improve that incrementally by setting your own kind of like targets. And that's where the sustainable financing comes in, is that it's different from a green bond, where green bonds are, given for green projects, and sustainability linked financing is more based on internal metrics and your own operation. So the idea is for the company to improve themselves from within, as opposed to like an external project that has been traditionally funded by green bonds.
Okay. And so I know originally and feel free to chime in, anyone, if you have questions. I haven't seen anything pop up in the chat, but just come off mute if you wanted to ask something. But in terms of like, working with or trying to get some sustainability financing, or working with impact investors, I know you were kind of building some connections there for people. So what's sort of like the best way for brands to connect with people that are able to finance impact projects and companies?
So I would say, like, calls like this, obviously a LinkedIn seems to be a great resource, and as well as just kind of exploring focusing on investors or banks, or, any type of private investor that has an interest in sustainability, first and foremost. If they don't, it's not worth your time. It is not worth your time to explain to them why this is important. There are so many investors out there that do care, that I have just found that, if you have to explain the importance of why you don't have hazardous chemicals in your food product, that's probably not going to be a great fit, right? Like, so I would say just starting there is helpful. And then coming at it from an ESG lens, and then talking about how your impact and your purpose, you know, it all ties together, that will help them visualize it from a financial point of view. Because, you know, I'm sure everyone has heard of ESG asset managed funds. These companies need to prove that the portfolio is doing ESG criteria similar to what my software talks about. So to your question about if it's operating with integrity and, you know, is it worth putting in these ESG metrics, it is, because that's the language that the financiers use, are this ESG language. So what the trick is to basically turn your purpose and your impact into ESG metrics. And it's just kind of like a switch of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, I mean, a lot of what we talk about is like understanding, you know, your core values as a company and having those help inform what your strategy is. And so that's what it makes me think of when you're talking about finding the right investors, is like, you really want to make sure that, yeah, you're not having to like explain and try to educate an investor on something that, you know, is not really in their wheelhouse, because you want to have somebody on board that's like fully on board with the values of the company and kind of that mission behind what you're doing. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Let's see. Questions. Anybody have a question for Amanda? Just want to make sure we get to cover things that are important for your specific company, because Amanda's a really good resource here. So feel free to ask. And let's see. No questions?
I'll just chime in real quick. So we are at a stage where we're trying to build that internal kind of ESG reporting model. And I like how you say you hate to give it a score, but that seems to be the simplest way that people, when you just have a discussion, that they want to try and present it. And it's pretty complex. So I guess my question is that what you're saying you do on a consultancy basis, or your software would take all of our data, all of our operations, and give it an ESG certification?
Not really. Yeah, no, not really. And I know like the struggle, right? Like people want to see those metrics. We're not going to track it for you, but we're going to basically help you identify your baseline and where you can make your targets, because what the financiers or lenders or, you know, people that we're kind of targeting are looking at are how can you improve? So what I think it could be helpful to you is where to focus on, right? Like, so are you like, and actually I have the apparel ones. Kate, is that okay? Can we just like kind of go through?
Sure. Sure, yeah.
Especially because that's great that you're starting your ESG program. And there's like softwares that you can use that, you know, I'm sure you all are familiar with ThreadUp. And they use a software that, you know, measures the amount of water and energy that they've saved, you know, based on whatever they're doing. And so, you know, you can use things like that. I think that's great for like marketing, and setting like metrics and stuff like that. But as far as if you are, hold on one second, let me pull it up. You as an apparel company, what the software is that you would get a link to participate in a survey. And we're going to collect some general information from you. We're going to ask you what your board looks like, what your ownership looks like, where you're at with sales. That's what we're asking everybody. Then the survey is going to tell you about the questions that we're going to ask you for. So for example, product quality and safety, how you manage chemicals in your product. It's going to talk about why that's important and give you just some like background information on why it's asking you this. So do your products contain hazardous or restricted substances? Do you have processes in place to monitor those substances regulations? What percentage of your product contains it? Have you worked with suppliers to reduce that? Have you had any product recalls? What was the monetary amount of those product recalls? And do you use a third-party verification for product testing? So that's kind of the type of questions that we're asking. And so then the survey is weighted and the back end that says, okay, well, if you said no to all of those questions, then these are some prime opportunities that you can create your program around, right? Like these are the metrics that you can say, this is what we're going to focus on. We're going to make sure that, you know, we use a third-party lab. We're going to make sure that, you know, 50% of our product doesn't have hazardous chemicals, you know, whatever. So that's kind of what the software does. It helps set goals and targets for companies and identifies where they're at.
For anybody that's like looked at some of these other criteria and like ways of measuring ESG, I think that sounds like very straightforward. Like I downloaded one thing, I can't remember whose it was. There was one company that does it, and their guide for how to use their software was like 250 pages long. And that was like just how to use the software. It wasn't even like the actual thing. So I think that this like makes more sense to me, because it's like, it's connecting to, like you were saying, the bottom line, and like, what are those pieces that are going to really affect your business going forward?
Yeah, because I mean, we're not gonna, the collection of data is not in our wheelhouse. That's not what we're trying to do. And it's because there are already lots of companies out there doing it. But you kind of really that's a big lift. And so really knowing like why you're collecting those metrics, what is it, you know, the purpose that you're going to use the metrics for. Personally, I think using blockchain is, you know, a better use of technology, at least as far as the supplier chain goes. So yeah, so I mean, you have to like monitor your impact, but are you monitoring the right impact?
Yeah, that makes sense. So what about in terms of like a more service-based company? So we had a question in the chat. Any advice on impact business models that support sustainable brands with tech marketing services? While we can certainly be a conscious company internally, the real multiplier impact comes from how our tech helps hundreds of sustainable brands secure new first-time customers online. So he's asking if there's any advice on sort of that third degree of separation in terms of impact when they're not producing a product.
Well, so that would be the same as mine. So I would say that you're a software. And so while your service is impacting sustainable businesses, it's really important for your business to be sustainable too. So it really is about being internally strong. And so what that would be, and we could just look at it right now, because it's really interesting, because it's going to be like obviously totally different than what, hold on, I think I missed it, but I mean, I know.
I mean, I haven't spent a lot of time on different companies with the B Corp certification, but I have looked at some of that, and I think that's where it's a little bit tough, because the questions, some of them are similar, and you have to kind of go through and figure out which ones make sense for your company and kind of how to monitor that.
Right. So like for software, what's you're going to be is like privacy concerns, what you're doing with customer information. Are you telling your customers what you're doing with that information? I can't remember the company that just got, you know, huge fines because they hadn't notified their users about what they were doing with their information. So I would say, Stephen, that could be something that you can look at, is all this information that you're collecting from your users or from your clients. You know, do you have strong policies in place, T's and C's, to, you know, clearly outline what you're doing with their information, and things like that. So you're going to be more affected by the G. Is your G strong? Is your S strong? Do you have diversity in your team? Do you have diversity in your board? Because that also matters.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, because there's less when you're working as like from an office and you're not producing a product, a physical product, then you just tend to not have so much in terms of the E, I suppose, because you're not creating any any outputs. Although, I mean, I have heard a lot more lately about kind of that the footprint of technology too, where where you have your servers and that kind of thing, because there are environmental impacts to kind of having that technology operating as well.
Very true. And there are questions on that as far as, handling your environmental impact on that, but that's it, right? Like that's the E, but you're right. That is valid.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, if you're a larger company, obviously you can have more in terms of like waste products from your office or something like that, or energy use from your office or something.
Right.
But yeah, when you're like a smaller company, it's really hard to measure that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Do we have any other questions? Okay. So one of the questions I had was about like if somebody's talking with an investor, what are some kind of like specific metrics or things that they really want to make sure to talk about in terms of showing the value of their company?
I think using the word material is really important, right? Like, so that if you're focusing on the material aspects of your company, the investor will know that what you're doing is important to your bottom line and for your operations. So if you're saying, and I would love to know, Doug, what you all are trying to do with your data, or like where you're being asked to collect data, because I think that's really important too, right? Like, what are you all being asked to do? Is it in the same lens, right? Because when you talk to an investor, you're going to want to tell them, like, this is what we're doing. This is how you can increase your sustainable finance. This is a very new financial product. So if you have an investor that's interested, or a lender that's interested in sustainability financing, this is a really good way to get them to open up that door to this new type of product, is by saying, hey, I have identified these ESG metrics. These are my new targets. I would love to get some sort of metric linked financing with you based on this.
Doug, did you want to share any of that?
Sure. So I'm not sure I quite understood the specific question. I can sum it up by saying we're looking at really attacking every aspect of the chain, from all the way from the soil all the way to in production, and the circular aspect of what happens to our products at the end of their life. And so we're looking right now at different ways to use blockchain to track that. We're looking at different ways through different certifications through some of our partners to track that and be transparent with it. And I don't know if that answers the question or the direction you were going with it. We haven't really figured out yet a system to house all that, because there's so many different moving parts. We're exploring it. And that was kind of the direction of my question to you. If you facilitated that, that would have been a godsend.
Yeah, no. Okay. So you're talking more about the circular economy, and having like this, a whole sustainable type of lens to that. So I would actually check out a company called Reaply. I just put it in the chat, and that's what they do. They help companies just like yourself identify the circular economy and really like the end use, things like that. So that could be like a really interesting way. So ESG is kind of just like, ESG is more of like the business practices, right? Like, so you're kind of talking about measuring and making metrics on, and looking at the environmental impacts, and where ESG is more like, what are your business practices that are going to affect ESG? So if you measure and find out that your supplier is polluting, are you going to change suppliers? Do you have a change management process in place that you are going to then change suppliers? And I think, and then you can say, okay, 100% of my suppliers qualify under this, type of certification. And so those are the kind of metrics that you can then bring to the lenders or the customers are saying, we've identified that this is a risk and this is an opportunity and this is how we're mitigating it. So that's kind of the difference. But Reaply is an awesome Chicago-based tech firm that does what you're talking about with the circular economy.
Okay, so and also, I mean, it's important from the business side too, which I understood that was the ESG side. I just wasn't sure. I guess we haven't been able to get a clear understanding of what it is that they are going to want us to report. I mean, we've started the B Corp certification. I think a lot of what you said is in that. So I think it's probably there. We'll be able to create that data, but to have a way to streamline it in a criteria or a viewable format that an ESG lender or ESG based impact investor would find attractive would be very helpful.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where my software can be helpful, is that if you focus on these type of questions and then make your report around that, that's what the investor is going to look at. And so for the SEC filings, that is what they're required to do, is that the investor is required to say, I have looked at my company portfolio and their material ESG, they're doing something in the material ESG criteria. So there's not a lot of regulation around it right now. That's the reason why it's so prone to greenwashing, and there's a lot of confusion, is because there isn't any like strict regulation where you like fill out like a checkbox and say, okay, this is what we're doing, which is why it's challenging to everyone that wants to do ESG or everyone that doesn't like ESG. So that's why we wanted to look at it just from, a very basic lens, like a very like easy way to look at ESG, we thought would be a good place to start.
Yeah.
I guess what oh, sorry, Kate.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I know. So I guess what I'm trying to understand, everything that you said makes total sense. In my opinion, I think that coming from a third party is very powerful. That's why I'm trying to understand, if I'm just writing up a report as an individual or as a brand and submitting it, it's going to be biased. So is your software kind of that third party independent verification or due diligence on the fact that we're doing what we say we're doing? I guess that's what I'm trying to understand.
Yes. And okay, thank you for explaining that. Yes, we are, and we'll get there, right? Like, we don't have the capability to collect documents to prove it as of yet, but that is what we heard from the banks and lenders, is that they want us to be that third party verifier, because you're right, it is all self kind of disclosure right now. But it is also on the company to have that information in place and accessible and being able to deliver that, when asked for. So we can be a depository for like different forms and different, documents. And if you wanted to like update your KPIs on like a quarterly basis, that's what our software is going to be able to do. But it's still coming from you. Like, there's still like, we're not going to go in and say, okay, like do an audit. Like, that's not what the software is going to do. It's going to be a way for you all to update and provide evidence that this is what you're doing.
So it sounds organizational, and obviously you would be able to take somewhat of a third party lens eventually. Maybe you're not quite there yet.
Yes, absolutely. Because we're not like a data verification, right? Like, I'm not collecting like your metrics of what your soil testing was and then, collecting that and analyzing it over the course of a year. That isn't what we're doing. And so that would be like a separate service with a different type of like ESG provider.
Cool.
Oh, that's really cool. I'm glad you asked the question, Doug, because I think that really helps clarify things for me too. And there's just like so many moving parts, but being able to focus on those very specific things that are going to really make an impact on your bottom line and communicate those to the investors and in other finance options would really make a big difference in terms of going from, like you said, not having a baseline at all and just sort of like trying to grab whatever metrics you can versus, okay, here are the actual material things that are going to make a difference. Awesome. One of the other questions I had was about, you mentioned blockchain in terms of tracking the supply chain and how that's going to become really big. And I definitely believe that. But do you have any like resources that you could share or any tips about where to kind of get more information about how to include that for a smaller company? Because I don't know that, and maybe everybody else does and it's just me, but I'm just thinking, like, it seems kind of like there doesn't seem like an obvious answer about where to go to kind of get that information of how to include blockchain with your supply chain.
Yeah, sure. I just put a company in, it's called Clear ESG. They are a blockchain company that, works with suppliers, and that is one that I know of. And then I know of another one that is, just starting out. And so I'm not sure they've gone live yet, but it's a relatively newer technology. So it's not like you're, you shouldn't probably know everything, but I mean, it's just it's something to keep an eye out for. And if you see it, know that that is valuable and that it will come in handy in the next couple of years. And so, like, if they're telling you like this is important, like, it's true, it's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally believe that. And I think that there's, some companies have been able to use that for the traceability aspect, and to be able to kind of share that with consumers as well. And so I definitely believe that. It's just that it's early enough that, it's not mainstream. So it's kind of harder to find resources about that. But I definitely see the future of that, and think that it would be really valuable for companies to kind of consider how they can incorporate that in how they operate.
Yeah, check out Clear ESG. They are a company that I know and that I've worked with, and I think that their product is, affordable and clear in what they're trying to do as well. So
okay, aptly named Clear ESG.
I know, right?
Okay, awesome. We've got a few minutes left. Does anybody else have any specific questions, either related to their specific industry, or a question about sustainable finance? Just want to make sure I give people a chance to ask any questions that they have specifically. Okay. So maybe you could, here's a question. Are there any earlier stage ESG investors that have invested in the CPG space? So it's tough. I know CPG investment is a little hard to come by these days. So
I don't know any off the top of my head, but I can look, because I definitely, right. I know, I'm also looking for aren't we all, like, but no, I mean, there are specific ESG investors that want to, support this. And so I can absolutely look and see what I have in my kind of toolbox as far as that, because since I'm not a CPG, firm, it wouldn't be applicable to me, but I'm sure I have it somewhere. So,
yeah. And I know I've had discussions with another CPG brand, talking about, she's using regenerative agriculture as the ingredients in the product. And she's so frustrated at how much investment agriculture gets, and because, it's kind of like that first level, easier to measure, but then it gets to the CPG space and like nobody wants to invest there. And so even if the agriculture is doing well, they're getting the money, they're doing more regenerative, then where does the product go? Like, I mean, it has to go in as an ingredient somewhere or into some consumer product. And if those companies aren't getting the investment, then, they're not able to get the products out to the stores and to the cabinets of people's homes.
Right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right about that. So no, I will look, I can see that that would be super helpful. And so I would love to help. I will scour my list and see if I can find some ESG, CPG investors at that earlier stage. I know that, we're not all at the, Series B rounds here. So I can appreciate that. I do have a question. It looks like somebody, because this sustainability linked financing is really popular in Europe. And so I was wondering, Leela, if you're still here, have you heard about this type of financing or, anything like that? It's very new in the US, but it's actually quite common in other countries.
Oh, let's see.
Oh, she might not be here anymore. And so, we can put that out there for. But so if you have investors or if you have products or if you have audience in other countries, like Asia or Europe or even, where else have I seen it? That mostly the EU and Asia are more doing these type of loans right now, and they're at a very large scale. So, I mean, I'm not saying that they're going to give like, $1 million, but it's an interesting way to come about it and to come into a conversation with a lender or a financer or a investor, because if they're interested in beefing up their sustainable finance portfolio, this could be like a really cool way to kind of tie it together and say, hey, like this is, something that would you be interested in? And then basically how it works is that the financing is linked to your goals. And so if you set goals and you make those goals, then your interest rate is lower. And if you don't hit those goals, then your interest rate is higher. So that's what this type of financing is. And that's why like having a baseline, setting goals, having those like kind of like targets, ambitious targets, and then being able to verify those targets is where our software is trying to go.
Yeah, that's very cool. So comment about the regenerative brands and CPG. Stephen shared a link to the Regen Coalition and said to check that out. I see that actually we had somebody here from Good Sam, and I know they've used that. So I think that Ryan's not here anymore, but yeah, another resource to check out for brands that are using regenerative.
Awesome. Thanks for putting that in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if we don't have any other questions, we can get wrapped up for today. Any last questions here? I don't see anything. Okay. Well, thank you. Oh, hold on. We got another question. Okay, Stephen's elaborating. Met a bunch of these brands at Expo West. We're working on a spreadsheet of brands in this space, as well as funders, investors.
Oh, cool.
So secret goal is to get some investors to sponsor a circle and good carts that boost those brands. Very cool. Thank you for doing that, Stephen, and definitely keep us posted. That sounds amazing. Awesome. So yeah, check out the Regen Coalition if you're interested, or connect with Stephen there. And then Amanda, I can send out any information that you have as follow-up if there, if you come across any investors or anything. Definitely I can forward it out to the people that were on the call. And Amanda's left her email here if you want to reach out. Good way to reach her. She's also on LinkedIn as well. And yeah, thank you so much. This has been great.
No, this has been great. It's really good for me too, to just kind of figure out, what the needs are and what you guys are looking for. And so I will send out some of my beta surveys based around apparel, agriculture products, and I'll create one for the wellness and the software, and take a look at them and fill them out as best as you can. You can really kind of get like a handle on what it would be for your particular company and like where you can kind of focus on. So please, provide any feedback, set up a meeting with me. I'm happy to talk, through your specific company. This is all really, great information and like data sharing.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us today. I hope this was a valuable call for you. And I know I learned something. Thanks for bearing with me on this, because I'm probably not the most knowledgeable in this field, but it's great to have Amanda here and be able to learn from her. So hopefully that was helpful for you as well. And then please, keep in touch. If you're not part of our Brand Pollinators community, I'm just going to share a link here where you can join us, and you'll get we do these calls every month free with an expert guest, and we also have an email that goes out every weekend, resources that you can use, awards you can apply for, events coming up, all kinds of things. So please feel free to join if you haven't yet, and reach out to me if you have any questions. I'll put my email in here as well. It's just kate@brandpollinators.com. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great day, everyone.